success.
Protecting women's rights in sports bathrooms and prisons. Deep dive podcast show. Let's dive in. In the heart of this nation, under skies so blue, there's a spirit that's stirring values strong and true.
Okay, if you've been paying attention at all to politics in the U.S. recently, you've probably noticed something about the language being used. It feels different, doesn't it? We're talking about how words like fascist or Nazi, terms that, used to be saved for the absolute worst regimes in history, now you hear them quite a lot. The sources we looked at show they're becoming almost routine insults, especially aimed at, say, conservative voters or Republican candidates. So for this deep dive, we wanted to cut through all that noise. We've gone through a whole stack of material political science stuff, social psychology research, polling data. We want to understand how this linguistic shift really happened. What are the psychological effects? And maybe most importantly, what does the actual data tell us about who tolerates political violence? Because there's a lot of talk about that. And the mission here, for you listening, isn't about picking a side in this name-calling game. Not at all. It's about really unpacking a key question. Is this just words getting overused, rhetorical inflation? Or, and this is the serious part, does using these labels actually lower our moral guardrails? Does it make it easier to justify, everything from shunning people socially to getting them fired, or even at the fringes, violence? Let's get into it.
It's really striking, isn't it? How quickly these labels went from being pretty much unthinkable for domestic politics to being almost standard fare. And the core danger, as the sources really point out, is exactly that normalization. When you take huge groups of people, we're talking tens of millions of your fellow citizens, your neighbors, maybe even family, and you start systematically branding them with these kinds of dehumanizing terms, it fundamentally changes how you perceive them.
You stop seeing them as just people you disagree with.
Exactly. They stop being, legitimate opponents who maybe just see things differently. They become something else entirely, something morally different. Monsters, as one source put it, rather than neighbors. And look, that kind of shift has real consequences for how a society, especially a diverse one, can even function. So yeah, this deep dive really demands some critical thinking. We need to think hard about what the sources call this linguistic arms race. We've structured it pretty logically, I think. First, we'll track down those specific quotes, the high-profile ones that really kicked off this normalization. Then we'll explore why this framing is so dangerous, the psychological side, the strategic side. And finally, we'll tackle that polling data on political violence. It's incredibly complex, often twisted in the media, and that's where, the real nuance is hiding.
Okay, so let's map out this timeline. How did fascist and Nazi go from being these ultimate historical taboos to regular partisan insults, especially against the GOP? Because the sources suggest this wasn't just some slow cultural drift. There were specific moments, specific things said by very prominent people.
Right. It often starts at the top, doesn't it? Those high-profile statements kind of grant permission for everyone else down the line. And the first big precedent, the one that really seemed to open the floodgates, was that basket of deplorables, quote, back in 2016.
Let's unpack that moment. Hillary Clinton at a fundraiser in New York. She drew a pretty sharp line.
She absolutely did. She stated pretty clearly that half her word of her opponent's supporters belonged in a basket of deplorables. And importantly, the sources really zeroed in on this. She didn't just leave it there as a general insult. She listed specific categories, really loaded terms.
Yeah, I remember that list.
Racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic. Those are about the most damaging social labels you can apply in today's world.
And the reaction was immediate, wasn't it?
Oh, it was huge. Instant explosion. And the sources tracked this clearly. Now, she did walk back the half number the next day, said she regretted the quantity, but crucially, she didn't retract the substance. The categorization itself, those labels. She stood by those.
So that was the first big step, you're saying. A major political figure basically writing off potentially tens of millions of Americans as irredeemable.
That's how the analysis frames it, yeah. It effectively gave a signal, maybe unintentionally, but a signal nonetheless, to large parts of the public and the media. It suggested it was okay to view your political opponents not just as wrong on policy, but as fundamentally toxic, fundamentally bad people.
Okay, so that set a kind of precedent. But the language kept escalating, right? Moving beyond just saying people were morally bad to comparing their ideology to actual totalitarianism. Fast forward about 6 years to 2022, President Biden's comments about semi-fascism.
Yeah, that was another really pivotal moment, rhetorically speaking. He was speaking in Maryland, I believe. And this time, it wasn't just about calling opponents immoral or deplorable. He applied a structural and ideological label. He explicitly described MAGA Republicans, his term, as being like semi-fascism.
And the sources point out he wasn't just talking about a specific policy they disliked, was he?
No, not at all. He directly linked that label to the idea that this group, this movement, posed an existential threat to American democracy itself. He even specifically tied them to political violence. So the analysis suggests this shifted the attack. It went from questioning the moral character of the voter, the deplorables idea, to attacking the ideological framework of the whole movement as being structurally dangerous. Semi-fascism.
And you could really see how the public conversation changed after that, couldn't you? The media coverage shifted.
Oh, definitely. The debate suddenly wasn't whether it was fair to make such a comparison. Instead, you started seeing mainstream articles, op-eds, cable news panels, all seriously debating whether MAGA met the historical criteria for fascism. Was it full fascism, semi-fascism? Where did it fit on the scale?
So the Overton window, that range of acceptable debate, it just lurched, didn't it?
It decisively shifted. Look, once a sitting president introduces a term like that into the mainstream, it becomes fair game. It gets normalized. It proved that a label that was once completely taboo in domestic politics had successfully migrated right into the center of routine political talk.
And that migration seemed to hit its peak, or maybe its most direct point, just recently in 2024. Vice President Kamala Harris was asked directly about the former president.
That's right. The question was point blank. Is Donald Trump a fascist? And her answer was just as direct. Yes, I do. Unequivocal. She then kind of doubled down on it, referencing comments from Trump's own former chief of staff, John Kelly, almost using that as internal validation to really cement the label.
So connecting the dots here, these aren't just random slips of the tongue, are they? The sources argue these high-level statements filter down. They act like, well, like instructions.
That's a good way to put it. An instruction manual. Think about the message it sends. When the top leaders in the country define tens of millions of their fellow citizens as deplorables, or semi-fascists, or actual fascists, that really empowers their own base, doesn't it? It implicitly gives permission to see the opposition not just as people you disagree with, but as enemies of the state, enemies of democracy itself.
And the analysis of this whole linguistic arms race points to some really chilling real-world consequences. We saw that in the tragic context of the Charlie Kirk killing that was documented.
Yeah, the reporting around that awful event noted that the term fascist had become so, I guess, common in political arguments online and offline, that it was allegedly part of the rhetoric the killer used or was exposed to. It shows this dangerous feedback loop, Extreme language from the top filters down, maybe is amplified online, and then it can validate or motivate the actions of people on the absolute fringes, people who are already unstable or looking for justification.
So this isn't just about words hurting feelings. We're talking about a documented pattern set by leaders that seems to be eroding basic civic norms.
That's the serious concern the sources raise. It's about the corrosion of the shared understanding required for a democracy to function peacefully.
Okay, so we've laid out what's being said and by whom these really high-profile examples. Now let's shift focus. Let's talk about the findings on what happens when these labels get thrown around all the time. Why is this framing so dangerous, beyond just being offensive or politically charged?
Right, because it goes deeper than just hurt feelings or political sparring.
Right.
This kind of framing targets something fundamental, something psychologically necessary for a diverse society like ours to work. It targets empathy and moral restraint. The most immediate danger, the one social psychology really highlights, is this mechanism of dehumanization.
Dehumanization, that sounds pretty stark. How does it actually work in a political context, according to the research?
Well, the research seems pretty consistent on this. When you use these broad brush labels, Nazi, fascist, even terms implying existential evil to describe your political opponents, you're essentially linking them in people's minds to the absolute worst atrocities in history. You bypass any kind of reasoned policy debate and trigger this deep, visceral, moral revulsion. And once you've successfully framed your opponent, not just as wrong, but as fundamentally evil or dangerous, well, psychologically, they start to seem less than fully human, at least in a political sense. Their views aren't just misguided, they're dangerous contagions.
That erosion of empathy, it's disturbing to think about. Do the sources give any examples of how quickly that switch can flip? From seeing someone as an opponent to seeing them as a kind of monster?
Yeah, historical examples unfortunately abound. Once any group gets successfully labeled as carrying some kind of existential threat, whether it's communists in the Cold War or globalists or now fascists, it acts like a permission slip. It creates this anything goes attitude towards them. Because if you genuinely believe your opponent represents an existential evil, a literal threat to your country or your way of life,
Then the normal rules don't apply anymore.
exactly, the normal rules of civic engagement, of debate, of tolerance, they just dissolve. Reprisal, trying to get them fired, social ostracism, even violence for some. It all starts to feel justified, necessary even. Like self-defense against this perceived evil, the moral guardrails just vanish.
Let's talk about the logical flaw here. The source analysis calls it the category error. This feels like the intellectual shortcut that enables this whole dangerous process.
Ah, the category error. Yes. It's fundamentally about intellectual laziness, really, but it masks itself as moral clarity or urgency. It's the failure or maybe the refusal to distinguish between a policy you think is bad, even really bad, and an ideology that represents pure historical evil.
Give us an example.
Okay, let's say you strongly disagree with a particular policy proposal. Maybe it's about border security or abortion access or tax rates or what's taught in schools, whatever it is. These are specific policy disagreements, right? They require specific arguments. You need to talk about the economic impact or the ethical implications or whether the policy will even work. That takes effort.
But the category error lets you skip all that hard work.
Precisely. Instead of building a case against policy X based on evidence and reason, the category error lets you just label the person proposing policy X a fascist or a proto-fascist. And boom, debate over. You've collapsed a potentially complex policy issue into a simple claim of ideological evil. It lets you jump straight to moral condemnation and feeling justified in punishing them rather than engaging in the messy, difficult work of persuasion.
It sounds incredibly effective for, say, mobilizing your own political base, getting them riled up, but fundamentally damaging for a democracy that relies on convincing people, not just condemning them.
Absolutely. It structurally replaces persuasion with polarization. It deepens the divides. And here's the kicker. There's a huge strategic backfire potential for the side that leans too heavily on these labels. One analysis we looked at made a strong case that swing voters, the independents, the moderates, the people who are kind of tired of the constant political warfare, and definitely don't see themselves as extremists. They just start tuning out. When the alarm bells are constantly ringing at maximum volume, screaming fascism about every little thing, people get desensitized.
It's the classic boy who cried wolf story, but playing out on a national stage with incredibly high stakes.
That's exactly the analogy used. If you cry fascism over and over again for things that clearly aren't fascism, maybe it's a tax policy you dislike, or a judicial appointment you oppose, the word loses its power, its meaning gets diluted, then if a genuinely existential threat, a real wolf, as the source puts it, actually does appear, your warnings might fall on deaf ears. You've exhausted your credibility.
So the end result of this cycle, if it just keeps spinning, is that it limits everyone's ability, including you, the listener, to actually engage productively. It forces us into these camps of perpetual threat rather than allowing for any kind of limited persuasion or compromise.
That's the ultimate danger to a functional republic, isn't it? This dehumanization process shuts down the mental space needed for finding common ground, even limited common ground. Look, if I see you as someone with bad policy ideas, we can argue, we can debate, maybe we can even find a compromise on some details like funding levels or how something gets implemented. But if I genuinely see you as a semi-fascist who's actively trying to destroy the country, well then compromise is impossible. It's betrayal. My only rational option in that frame is total opposition, total defeat of the enemy, by any means necessary. That fundamental shift in perception is why this framing is so profoundly dangerous. It makes peaceful coexistence seem naive, even reckless.
Okay, let's pivot to the data. Because we hear these claims constantly, don't we? In the media, online, about which side is more tolerant of political violence or which party poses the sort of unique danger. But the sources we dug into, especially the polling data, they paint a much more complicated picture, maybe a more disturbing one, honestly. It suggests this dangerous mirror effect where the potential for violence exists across the board. We really need to get past the spin here and look at the numbers.
Yeah, this section requires real precision. Because when you're talking about something as sensitive as justifying political violence, you absolutely have to look at the exact questions asked in these polls. The methodology matters. And the nuances in the findings often get completely lost in the headlines.
Right. So let's start with a baseline. That 2021 survey from the Chicago Project on the Security and Threats, CPOST. What did that initial broad look reveal?
Okay, so CPOSD looked at the willingness to justify political violence right now, just as a general concept. And the headline finding was pretty shocking. About 9% of Americans overall said yes, political violence is justified right now. But here's the crucial nuance, the part that often got glossed over. In that specific survey, with that general framing, Republicans and Democrats reported very similar percentages, roughly the same level of baseline tolerance.
Wow, so similar numbers at the baseline, but were they justifying it for the same reasons?
No. That's where the polarization really showed up. The reasons people gave for potentially justifying violence were often starkly different, mirroring their political anxieties. The analysis showed that folks on the left who felt violence might be justified tended to cite things like fighting systemic oppression, the urgency of climate change, or needing to defend against what they saw as rising right-wing extremism or authoritarianism. Whereas those on the right pointed more towards things like perceived government overreach, fears about election integrity, defending constitutional rights, or protecting traditional cultural values from attack. The numbers were similar, but the drivers, the fears fueling that tolerance, were worlds apart.
Okay, so that's the baseline. Moving forward to 2022, there was a poll by Brightline Watch. This one asked a more specific conditional question, didn't it, about justifying violence if the other side won an election. That really tests commitment to democratic outcomes.
Exactly. It tests the willingness to reject the results of the democratic process itself. And that poll did reveal a noticeable asymmetry, although maybe still within that troubling mirror framework. It found that 13% of Republicans said violence might be justified if Democrats won future elections. For Democrats, the figure was 8% saying violence might be justified if Republicans won.
So a 5-point difference there. Higher on the Republican side for that specific scenario.
Yes, and the sources are quick to stress. But look, these are still minority viewpoints, thankfully. We're talking less than 1 in 7 people, roughly.
But still, the very idea that a chunk of the electorate in a democracy would justify violence just because their side lost an election, that's deeply corrosive, isn't it?
Absolutely. It strikes at the very heart of peaceful transitions of power. Even if the absolute numbers seem low, the potential impact is huge. And if we look at data suggesting an increase in acceptance, we have to talk about the 2023 PRI survey. That one used really evocative language. It framed violence almost as a necessity.
All right, that was the one that asked about the statement. True American patriots may have to resort to violence to save the country. That's a very different framing, introduces this idea of patriotic duty.
And the findings there show the most significant gap between the parties in most of these major surveys. About 1 in 5 Republicans, that's 20%, agreed with that statement. A substantial minority willing to endorse violence framed as a necessary act to save the nation.
And what was the number for Democrats on that same question?
It was lower. About 1 in 10 Democrats, so 10%, agreed with that sentiment.
So double the rate among Republicans in that specific poll with that specific framing about patriotic duty.
Correct. So if you synthesize all this data, the overall picture becomes clearer, if not simpler. Polling generally shows that tolerance for political violence, sadly, exists across the political spectrum. It's not confined to one side. However, most major surveys, especially the ones that frame violence as potentially necessary to combat existential threats or fulfill a patriotic duty, tend to show somewhat higher levels of support on the right compared to the left.
So the big takeaway isn't that one side is pure and the other is evil. It's that the danger is present across the board, even if the degree or the reasons might differ depending on the specific poll question or the current political climate.
Exactly. The fundamental danger isn't necessarily about pinpointing which side is worse at any given moment. It's the overall normalization. It's the fact that these aren't just fringe views held by a tiny handful. We're talking about sizable minorities within both major parties expressing openness to violence under certain conditions. That's the threat to democratic stability.
And there's another critical finding in the data that often gets buried under the partisan headlines, the generational aspect.
Yes, this is so important and often overlooked. Several sources highlighted that younger Americans, generally defined as those under 30 or maybe 35, are statistically more likely than older Americans to say that political violence could be justified in certain situations.
And that's true regardless of their party, Republican, Democrat, Independent.
That's the key finding. It cuts across party lines. Younger Republicans and younger Democrats show higher tolerance than their older counterparts.
Why do you think that gets missed so often? And what does it suggest?
Well, it gets missed because, frankly, the media narrative loves the red versus blue conflict story. It's simpler, more dramatic, but what it suggests is pretty profound. It implies the problem might not just be about our current partisan battles. It could point to something broader, maybe a generational disillusionment with traditional, nonviolent democratic processes. Perhaps a feeling that the system isn't working or isn't responsive, leading some younger people to consider more radical actions. Or maybe it's related to greater exposure to radicalizing content online. It's complex.
That leads perfectly into the ultimate synthesis. The sources offer the why behind these numbers. Drawing from peer-reviewed research, like that study in the European Journal of Political Research, it points to a core psychological driver.
Right. This research really gets to the heart of it. It argues that support for political violence isn't intrinsically linked to being left-wing or right-wing. It's not hardwired to ideology itself. Instead, support for violence tends to spike dramatically when people perceive existential threats.
Existential threats. Meaning,
when citizens genuinely come to believe that if the other side wins, it won't just be bad policy. It'll be the literal end of their country, their way of life, their fundamental rights, or the Constitution itself. When the stakes feel that high, truly existential, their tolerance for breaking norms, including resorting to violence, goes way up.
wow. Okay, so that connects directly back to the rhetoric we discussed earlier. Using terms like fascist, semi-fascist, deplorables, calling opponents an existential threat that isn't just rhetoric, it's actively pouring fuel on the fire that makes violence seem more acceptable.
It's the dangerous feedback loop in action. Think about how those existential threats manifest, according to the source contexts. For many on the left, the perceived threats might revolve around irreversible climate change, the loss of democratic institutions, the erosion of voting rights, or the elimination of rights like abortion access. A victory for the other side feels like it could guarantee, say, an uninhabitable planet or the end of equality. Existential.
And for many on the right,
The perceived existential threats often center on things like mass immigration leading to cultural replacement, economic collapse due to socialist policies, the loss of national sovereignty, rigged elections destroying democracy, or the total breakdown of traditional values and religious freedom. A victory for the other side feels like it could mean the end of America as they know it. Also existential.
So, because both sides can feel under existential threat, depending on the issue and the political moment.
Either side can show higher tolerance for violence. It depends entirely on who feels most threatened, whose back is against the wall in the current political climate.
Which means the ultimate danger isn't just the current numbers, it's the whole dynamic. The normalization, the mirroring, where each side's fear and extreme rhetoric licenses the other side to escalate their own.
Precisely. The political middle ground vanishes because everyone is convinced they're in a fight for survival. And when you think you're fighting for survival, well, normal rules tend to go out the window.
Okay, so we've seen how the rhetoric escalates and how the polling reflects a worrying tolerance for violence, often driven by that sense of existential threat. The sources also look at what happens after moments of actual political violence, like the documented killing of Charlie Kirk. It seems the reaction often makes things worse, not better.
Yeah, it often triggers this really unfortunate, almost predictable vicious cycle. In the aftermath of that specific documented event, we saw an immediate flare-up of really incendiary language across the board. On one side, some figures on the right responded with calls for, quote, vengeance and retribution, framing it almost as a necessary response to perceived cultural hostility. Meanwhile, some on the left used the tragedy to double down on arguments that the right is inherently uniquely violent, essentially justifying their own prior harsh rhetoric.
So instead of a moment for reflection or de-escalation, it becomes fuel for the fire. Each side uses the other's reaction to justify its own extremes. It's a spiraling permission structure for more hostility.
Exactly. A permission structure. That's a great way to put it. So if that feedback loop is the core problem, what's the way out? How do we break the cycle? The sources don't just diagnose the problem, they offer potential remedies. They propose a clear set of standards aimed at bringing back some discipline, some precision into how we argue and how we use language.
Standards for debate. Okay, let's lay those out. It sounds like we need some rules of engagement. What's the first one? It seems like it has to address the core issue we started with.
It does. Standard 1 is reserve the labels. Simple, but crucial. This is basically a call for intellectual honesty and historical accuracy. We absolutely must reserve words like fascist and Nazi for actual historically defined fascism and Nazism. The sources define those movements by specific characteristics. Things like hypernationalism, militarism, authoritarian control, a merger of state and corporate power, violently suppressing all opposition, often a toxic ideology of racial purity.
Right. So disagreeing with someone's tax policy or their stance on energy regulations doesn't make them a Nazi.
Not even close. If the ideology or the specific actions don't align with that rigorous historical definition, you simply cannot use the label accurately or responsibly. Calling, say, a state legislature debating immigration policy fascist is not only inaccurate, it dilutes the word. It trivializes the real horror of historical fascism. And the danger is, if everything becomes fascism, then nothing is fascism. We lose the ability to recognize and fight genuine totalitarian threats if they ever truly emerge. We need that linguistic restraint to keep the alarm bells meaningful.
That restraint then forces us towards the second standard, which is about how we structure our criticisms. Standard 2, target arguments, not people.
Exactly. This is all about precision. If you have a legitimate criticism, maybe you think the government mishandled the Hunter Biden laptop situation, or you believe COVID lockdown policies went too far, or you disagree with how gender identity is being defined in law, then state that specific argument. Make your case clearly. Use evidence. Explain why you think the policy is wrong or harmful.
Instead of taking the shortcut, the category error we talked about.
Precisely. Avoid the shortcut. The sources emphasized that being precise in your criticism focusing on the argument or the policy eliminates the need for these broad, dehumanizing labels. If you attack an opponent's healthcare plan by pointing out specific flaws in his funding mechanism, you're inviting a debate. If you just call the person proposing the plan a socialist trying to destroy America or a fascist, you've slammed the door shut. And strategically, calling your opponents names like fascist doesn't persuade anyone who isn't already on your side. It doesn't win over swing voters. All it really does is fire up your own base and justify the other side escalating in return.
Okay, the third standard feels like a fundamental moral baseline. Standard 3, condemn violence always.
This one has to be non-negotiable, right? The standard stresses how vital it is to condemn political violence, and especially the celebration of political violence, universally. No exceptions. It doesn't matter who the perpetrator is. It doesn't matter who the target is. Whether the victim is someone like Charlie Kirk or a well-known progressive figure, cheering on violence or murder is never acceptable. It's not speaking truth to power or karma, as some might try to frame it. It's just depravity.
And that universality is key, isn't it? You can't just condemn violence when it happens to your side.
Absolutely critical, because the moment you apply a double standard, condemning violence against your allies, but excusing or downplaying it when it targets your opponents, you implicitly license it. You signal that violence is a legitimate tool, just depends on who's using it and against whom. That guarantees escalation. The moral line against using violence to settle political disputes has to be absolute and held firm by everyone, regardless of how deep the policy disagreements go.
Standard 4 tackles something that gets really confused in online debates. Free speech versus consequences. Standard 4. Know the difference between rights and jobs.
Yes, this distinction is crucial and often deliberately muddled. People often cry First Amendment violation or censorship when they face non-governmental consequences for things they say. The sources are clear. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution places limits on what the government can do to restrict your speech. It does not generally limit what private employers, social media companies, or other private organizations can do.
So if someone posts something truly offensive or hateful online and their private employer fires them, that's not usually a First Amendment issue.
Generally, no. The analysis points out that workplaces, private businesses, they have a legitimate right, maybe even a responsibility, to manage their environment and reputation. They can discipline or terminate employees for speech that creates a hostile work environment, violates company policy, discriminates, or causes significant reputational damage. The sources suggest framing this not as cancel culture, but as necessary stewardship. Companies are stewarding their workplace environment, their brand, their obligations to other employees and stakeholders. The right to free speech doesn't guarantee you the right to keep a specific job or use a specific private platform if your speech violates their rules or harms their interests. Understanding that difference is key.
Okay, and the final standard brings us back to the data we discussed. Standard 5. Mind the data. Truth beats spin.
This is basically a call for intellectual honesty, applied to everyone, commentators, politicians, activists, and us as consumers of information. We have to confront the actual evidence, even when it's uncomfortable or doesn't fit our preferred narrative. So that means acknowledging when the polling data, like some of those CPOS or Brightline Watch numbers, show similar levels of problematic views on both sides. You can't just ignore that. And equally, it means acknowledging when the data, like perhaps the PRRI findings on the Patriots resorting to violence question, does show a higher trend on one side compared to the other for specific questions. The point is, we have to let the empirical reality, the facts as best we can determine them, guide the discussion. We have to resist the temptation to cherry-pick or spin the data just to score political points. That distortion only deepens mistrust and escalates the perceived threats. Truth has to come before spin. Hashtag tag outro.
All right, let's try to pull all these threads together. We've covered a lot of ground here, from the specific language used by top leaders to the psychological effects, the polling data, and these proposed standards for debate. If there's one core takeaway from this deep dive, it seems to be this. A healthy republic, a functioning democracy, it needs disagreement. It needs fierce debate, precise arguments about policy, about the direction of the country. That's vital. But what it likely cannot survive, at least not in a healthy form, is the constant, casual, widespread use of these profoundly dehumanizing labels: fascist, Nazi, deplorable. The source material really lands on a powerful closing thought. If we, all of us participating in this democracy, consuming media, talking politics, we don't find the discipline to retire these labels, to argue more precisely, we risk continuing to train, as one source put it, the worst among us to treat politics as a permission slip for cruelty. This linguistic arms race we've documented, it's not just making us angrier, it's making us potentially more dangerous to each other. The path back, according to the analysis, isn't easy, but it seems essential. It boils down to maybe two key steps. First, consciously retiring these dehumanizing labels that equate millions of our fellow citizens with pure evil, forcing ourselves instead to be more specific, more precise in our actual arguments. And second, fiercely defending that moral line against violence, against the celebration of violence, no matter who the target is, no matter what side they're perceived to be on, recommitting to nonviolent ways of resolving our deep disagreements.
And if we circle back to that core finding from the research, that the perception of existential threat is the main psychological driver pushing people towards accepting violence, then the final, maybe provocative, thought to leave you with, the listener, is really about your own role in this. If both sides increasingly feel like they're fighting for their very survival, convinced the other side poses an existential threat, what specific practical steps could be taken not just by politicians, but by you, in your own conversations, in your social media use, in how you engage with news, to actively try and lower that temperature, to reduce that perception of existential threat across the political divide? If you find yourself thinking your political opponent is basically Hitler, how might you adjust your own language, your own approach, to try and reestablish a shared reality where they are seen, perhaps, as deeply misguided opponents, but not as literal embodiments of evil that must be destroyed? It's worth considering how our own words, our own assumptions contribute, even in small ways, to this overall climate of perceived threat.
Can make sense. Protecting rights. Privilege rights, bathrooms and prisons. Deep dive podcast show. Let's dive in the heart of this nation, under skies so blue, there's a spirit that's stirring, values strong and true. From the mountains to the prairies, from the cities to the sea, we stand for liberty, for faith and family. We're diving deep into the heart of what we believe.